So yes, the topic is From Hobbits to HTML. I was born in the centennial year of Canada in the mythical city of Moose Jaw, the source of all my inspiration. Now I know that there is a real city by the name of Moose Jaw that exists at the intersection of the Moose Jaw River and Thunder Creek in the province of Saskatchewan. It was named after the Plains Cree word Moose Gaw, which means warm breezes. Or it was named because the river is in the shape of a jaw. Or, well, let's just say the details are fuzzy. Moose Jaw is real, but it is also a city that exists in an imaginary landscape. Through some magical process, many people know its name. It appears in Kurt Vonnegut's novel, Galapagos, as one character considers claiming to be from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. He never does actually use the claim, but he does consider to use it. And also, it appears in that famous, very famous Laverne and Shirley episode, Murder on the Moose Jaw Express. I know you've all seen it, and I was really tempted to actually get the video and play the whole episode for you, but if you want to see it, you can go to YouTube. I mean, it's really there. And finally, Moose Jaw appears on The Simpsons. I mean, isn't that just the height of all fame? With all proper apologies to Moose Javians, and that is the name that they like to use, it is a name that makes people laugh. Though not everyone knows where Moose Jaw is, they know that it exists. Case in point, I once had the pleasure of a private luncheon put on by my New York publisher with 12 librarians from various parts of the city. It was a very fancy deal. When I was finished my chicken and my presentation, one of the librarians came up to me and said, "I'm so happy to meet you." I was so happy to hear that. I hoped and perhaps assumed that the next words out of her mouth would be, "I loved your book." We authors do tend to enjoy compliments. Instead, she said, "I've never met anyone who was born in Moose Jaw before." Now, this was an important lesson to me, both in humility and in the importance of my birthplace. Even in New York City, they have heard of Moose Jaw. And I've used the city as often as possible in my novels because of that. So Moose Jaw is my mythical birthplace, but I was raised on a ranch in southwest Saskatchewan in the Cypress Hills. The highest elevation, as we just heard, between the Rockies and Labrador. My father was a rancher with about 10,000 acres of land and 500 head of Hereford cattle. At times, 3 hired men were needed to help with all the work, though as the ranch grew more automated, the workforce became smaller. It's a beautiful place in more ways than I can count, and the area is bountifully rich in history. On our ranch, you'll find buffalo wallows dug out hundreds of years before by bison wanting to rid themselves of flies. There are fossilized fish in the valleys, arrowheads in the fields, and teepee rings at the tops of several hills. And through those same hills, the Northwest Mounted Police rode to build their camp in Fort Walsh, sent there by the government after the Cypress Hills Massacre of 1873. It was here my imagination was allowed to grow. See, I was once cute, and once my hair wasn't gray, a long time ago.
Sorry to interrupt. It is such a lovely presentation. I just think we can see the pictures better if we turned out some of the ambient light.
If you turn, okay. As long as they can see me, too.
Yeah. I don't know if that can happen, but I'm just asking.
Is that clear enough for everybody? Okay, good. And yes, I'll need that light. I was going to use my laser vision, but last time I burned the paper, and it just didn't work out. So I attended school in the village of Tompkins, which has a population of nearly 200. There were 10 people in my class, 7 boys and 3 girls. And as I like to say whenever I talk to schools, I often go, we won't talk about who got dates and who didn't get dates, because that would be really depressing. These days, we pay thousands of dollars to send our kids to private schools to have such small classes. In rural Saskatchewan, it was the norm. Inside that school, I had 2 experiences that changed my life. The first was the arrival of Mr. Fitzgerald, my 4th grade teacher, who was straight out of university. He read The Hobbit to us. This was my first introduction to Tolkien and high fantasy, and I was entranced. Giant spiders, golem, a ring that turns people invisible, hobbits with their hairy feet, and a talking dragon. Entranced is perhaps the wrong word. Maybe obsessed is better, because when we were about halfway through the book, my parents took my family to Disneyland. I have a memory of sitting in the plane worrying about how much of The Hobbit I'd miss. Mr. Fitzgerald also taught us to play Dungeons and Dragons, often at the expense of our math classes. I still haven't learned my multiplication tables. The game is essentially a choose-your-own-adventure. There were maps, multi-sided dice, manuals with titles like Men and Magic and Monsters and Treasure, and all of the action took place inside your head. I quickly became addicted, drew my own maps, created vast worlds that would take 20 pages of foolscap laid out in a square. In time, as the grades passed, I became the dungeon master, the one who describes the story of the game for other players. Dungeons and Dragons is a curious thing. It becomes a shared memory. I can still go to my closest friends and say, remember that time when we were in that back alley and that dwarf walked down and you were going to rob him and it turned out he was a demigod and he made the earth crack asunder and left you all naked so you had to go shivering back to the pub? And they'll all go, yeah, I remember that. It is in many ways as real, as rich as a real memory. Mr. Fitzgerald taught for only 1 year, but what an impression he made. The other discovery that changed my life was my own. In that same year, in the little library of my school, hidden between Hardy Boys books and ancient encyclopedias, I discovered The Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander. This was the first book of a 5-book series, and it became as equally as important as The Hobbit. The first lines of the book still ring so true in my mind, lines that would encourage any boy to read further. Taran wanted to make a sword, but Coll, charged with the practical side of his education, decided on horseshoes. And so it had been horseshoes all morning long. Why? Taran cried. Why must it be horseshoes? As if we had any horses. For a ranch boy who often daydreamed about a night, these few lines captured my life situation perfectly. I took the book home and followed Taran through 5 books that comprised the Prydain Chronicles. Years later, when my school had a book sale, my mother bought that very same copy. According to the library card in the back, I took it out 3 times that year. You can see that I was the second person to take it out, Arthur Slade, and my writing is it's actually worse now than it was back then. And I was also the 4th person to take it out, and then I was the last person to take it out. Nobody took it out since about 1977, so that actually makes me a little bit sad. But hey, I still got to buy it, so I'm happy about that. Because I needed to read the final 4 books in the series, and since they weren't available in our small library, I learned the importance of our provincial library and the interlibrary loan system. Our provincial library was downtown, a 10-minute walk away, and it was open twice a week, and its keeper was Emily the librarian. Yes, she does have a last name, but I only know her as Emily. She ordered the rest of the series and also anything I could think of. Books on the Roman Empire, Norse mythology, and medieval torture weapons. Whatever I could think of, she would order it. She was like the human version of Google, except slightly slower. It was the beginning of my long relationship with libraries. At this early age, I did write. I began a novel here, a short story there, though I never completed anything. I finished a poem which I showed to my mother. I'm quoting kind of from memory, but the lines were something like this. So this is hell. I think as I smell the devil's awesome breath. He ties me to a torture rack and whips my clothless, painful back. I hear the cries of the condemned and know on them whips rip and rend. If you have a choice please make it well. Don't come to be with me in hell. Now, my mother told me that it was a very good poem and that I shouldn't show it to Grandma. I had learned an important lesson, that poems could be judged as good and poems could be judged as bad. In my defense of the subject matter, I want to point out that the Gideons had given copies of the Bible to every student in 5th grade, and I was particularly interested in Revelations. It's where all the fun stuff happens. That same year, Star Wars was released. At the time, I must have begged and pleaded my dad to take the whole family to see the movie in Shaunavon, a 40-minute drive across the bench and through the Cypress Hills. I can remember the very first scene of the Imperial cruisers floating above the camera, the ship seeming so impossibly powerful and massive. My mind nearly exploded with excitement. And I feel like we should actually watch that scene. I'll stop it there. I assume you don't want to see the whole movie, or maybe some of you have seen it before, I'm not sure. But that whole scene, it really, really did. I feel like it changed my brain entirely. I'd watched other movies, but this Star Wars, it was as though the movie were coming out of some secret place where all the perfect stories were. Poor farmer boy Luke Skywalker crosses the galaxy to save Princess Leia against the evil Sith Lord Darth Vader. George Lucas had taken King Arthur, The Lord of the Rings, and every science fiction novel I'd ever read and jammed them all into one story. I begged to see it again and again. Though living so far from a theater, I only managed to see it 3 times until it was released on satellite TV, and then I would just watch it every day. My writing and my focus changed. I was a director now and a screenplay writer. I wrote a script called Space Ranger, essentially Star Wars all over again, and I had all sorts of plans to turn it into a film, but never could get the budget together. I did make other movies with my friends from school. My parents had purchased an 8mm camera for me, and I should pause to point out that my parents have always been overwhelmingly supportive of my creative choices in life. The movies had no scripts, but with garbage can shields and blue robes and plastic swords, we shot the classic, the wizard, the warrior, and the wolf. There was blood, lots of it, thanks to ketchup. And magical disappearances were achieved by stopping the camera and having a character run off screen, then starting the camera again. Later, I would use a pin to painstakingly scratch the film to create the effect of lightning shooting out of the wizard's hands. But George Lucas, I was not to be. And I should maybe pause to mention you should be thankful that I didn't get those films turned into little video clips I could play you. I actually looked at it, and it was a little bit expensive, so I didn't do it. I apologize for that. I should have gone all out. What did sweep me up was the science fiction and fantasy worlds of Robert Heinlein, Roger Zelazny, Isaac Asimov, Robert E. Howard, and Stephen King. Finally, towering above them all was Ray Bradbury. It felt as though he had written each of his stories for me personally. I starred in them, I understood them, and they took root in me. The Martian Chronicles is a book that still, even when it's just mentioned, gives me that rush of imagination and chills that I'm always hoping to capture with my own writing. Years later, I sent Ray Bradbury a copy of Dust, and he was kind enough to send me a reply that stated he was happy to hear he had another literary son out there in the world. It is a cherished prize. And I won't read it to you, but I will point out that he typed it out, and there were some spelling mistakes. And at the very end, he says, "Forgive my lousy typing. I'm recovered from a recent illness. I will not supply details. To hell with it." So in my real life, though, other events were happening. On December 12, 1980, my older brother David was driving with 2 of his friends on the number 1 highway near Tompkins. A group of teens had parked their car on the side of the road just over the rise of a hill. My brother came over the hill, hit the brakes, and his Mustang struck a patch of ice that threw the car into a 360-degree turn in the opposite lane. An oncoming car struck the driver's side door, and he was killed instantly. One of his closest friends, who was seated in the back seat and not wearing a seatbelt, died a short time later from internal injuries. His third friend, who was wearing a seatbelt, survived. All three of them were 17 at the time. These are the basic facts of my brother's death. And since this is a lecture about my writing, I won't go further into the details. I'm always leery about attempts to explain how an author's personal life intersects with his written life. The whole idea of imagination is that it doesn't always have to intersect with the real world. That said, I do know that David was my hero, someone I looked up to, and that I learned on that day that heroes could die and that nothing you hold dear is permanent or safe. In my stories, I rarely write a perfectly happy ending. I do feel that works of imagination, no matter how far the flight of fancy takes us, should reflect both the joy and the tragedy of life. Students who have read Dust often ask, why didn't all the children get rescued? They want the happy ending. They want the Disney ending. I answer, because there's a price that must be paid. The pain that you feel at their loss makes the ending stronger. Or other readers of Megiddo's Shadow will ask me, why did she die? The she being the nurse that Edward, the protagonist, has fallen in love with. This I have the exact answer for, and the answer is blame Hollywood. Let me explain. In 11th grade, we were taught The Cruel Sea, a novel by Nicholas Montserrat that recounts the Royal Navy's involvement in the Battle of the Atlantic during World War II. My memory of the novel is sketchy, but I do recall quite clearly that First Lieutenant Lockhart falls in love with a beautiful wren, that is a woman from the Women's Royal Navy Service. Near the end of the book, she drowns when her ship sinks. It absolutely broke my heart. The sea truly was cruel, thus the title of the book. But it turns out Hollywood was even more cruel, for in the movie, she miraculously lives. I was livid. They had missed the point, so I had to rectify that in my own book. Sadly, because of Hollywood, the nurse in Megiddo's Shadow had to die. I continued to write throughout high school, but it wasn't until the 11th grade when our class was assigned a short story project that I truly took on the mantle of being a writer. I handed in a story entitled Pandora's Box. I, of course, thought the reference to the Greek myth of Pandora was clever. It was the tale of a computer programmer who designed a program that would find the Antichrist. But instead of just finding the Antichrist, it created the Antichrist. I received 100%. At that moment, I, like a sheriff of the Old West, put on the badge that said writer. The story went on to receive an honorable mention in a countrywide contest. The validation of my teacher, of my friends, and of the contest must have affected me because whenever someone asked, "What are you going to do when you graduate?" I began to answer, "Be a writer." It became clear that in order to be a writer, I had to keep on writing things. So I wrote more short stories, and in my spare time finished my first novel, a fantasy titled The Bard Song. I had a gleaming vision of what the writer's life entailed. I learned quickly that it wouldn't all be rosy. The Bard Song was rejected by 8 publishers before I, too, gave up on it. I enrolled in the University of Saskatchewan in order to get an English honors degree. It was never my intention to actually get a job afterwards. No, those 4 years were a buffer zone from real life. I would write, and do my studies, of course. My plan was to be making a living from writing by the time I was finished university. It didn't quite work out that way. While taking classes, I wrote another fantasy novel, The Black Oak, that was painfully rejected by 50 publishers. I followed that with a horror novel that was rejected by 50 publishers. However, I did graduate, and while not making a living as a novelist, I did begin working at a radio station writing advertising. And I became living proof that you can get an English degree and get a job. During that time, I wrote another horror novel that was rejected by over 50 publishers. Does anyone see a pattern here? I wrote a fifth novel, rejected, and then a sixth. That novel was entitled The Dragonfly's Journey, the story of a young man who quits his day job in radio advertising and goes, I'm not sure where I got the idea from, and goes on a spiritual journey. Oddly enough, I had just quit my radio job and moved back to the ranch to write part-time and be a farmhand part-time. Not quite a spiritual journey. The book wasn't accepted by any publishers, but it did change the course of my career. After several rewrites, I sent it to a reading service offered by the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. The service involved blind critiquing by a published author. Blind critiquing prevents angry up-and-coming authors from egging the house of a published author should there be a bad review. The critique came back jammed with glowingly positive remarks, and here was the kicker. The Dragonfly's Journey was a great novel for young adults. What an insult! I had written a book for adults. What an embarrassment! But I didn't give up on The Dragonfly's Journey. Though it had been rejected multiple times, I used the services of a print-on-demand publisher and published the book myself and learned my first lesson about how hard the financial side of writing could be. It sold 15 copies. That's 1-5, folks, 1-5. I read their critique again, and the letter inspired me. I realized that my sparse style of writing was likely perfect for a younger audience. I sat down and intentionally wrote a book aimed at middle grade readers.